One of the oldest strategies in the enemy's playbook is to bring division. Division in homes, division in marriages, division in finances, division on the job, division in churches, and especially division among the generations. On today's episode of Remnant Voice, we're going to be looking at what happens when generations actually come together. So stay tuned as we talk and teach about what happens when we discover that Joseph is alive and Jacob is revived. Hey everyone, I'd like to invite you to connect with Remnant Fire Ministries across several social media platforms. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Remnant Nation. Also, you can find us on Twitter at twitter.com/Remnant Fire. We are on YouTube as well, and on YouTube I'll be posting and uploading videos and episodes of the show. You can find us on YouTube at youtube.com/The Remnant Fire. Hey everyone, I'd like you to go to the website and check out Remnant Voice on the web. Go to remnantvoice.tv. There on remnantvoice.tv, you'll be able to find episodes on demand, past episodes, shows that you may have missed. You'll be able to find those episodes at remnantvoice.tv. Also, I'd like to invite you to stay in touch with the ministry, Remnant Fire Ministries, on the web as well. Go check us out at remnantfireministries.com. There on the website, you'll be able to read articles that are posted there. Also, you'll be able to keep track of the schedule that as I travel and minister at different locations, you can find out where I'm at by remnantfireministries.com, and then under the schedule tab, you can find out where I'll be ministering there. So again, I want you to check out remnantvoice.tv and remnantfireministries.com. Thank you for tuning in to Remnant Voice. We're going to be looking at what happens when generations come together today. And so I want to start over in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. It says, "But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come. Men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents." It says, "Unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, and without self-control." It also says they'll be traitors, headstrong, lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God. And I would say to you, that's not just in the world, guys, that's in the church. And it says, having a form of godliness. There it is. That's why it's in the church. Having a form of godliness, but denying the power of. They have this form of Christianity, but there's no power to function. And so this is the generation that we're living in. Proverbs chapter 30 is another key verse when looking at the generation. It says this, "There is a generation that curses its father," and it says, "and does not bless its mother. There is a generation that is pure in their own eyes, yet is not washed from its filthiness." That is, yes, that was a generation at the time, but even so much more, even now, that is the generation in which we're living in, that they're saying they're pure in their own eyes, that everything is okay. I can live any way I want to. I don't have to have a certain moral code or certain way. There's not a standard that I have to live by. I'm my own God. I'm pure in my own eyes. I don't have to be washed. Don't give me that message about the blood of Jesus. I'm already pure. I don't need that. So this is the generation that it is. And in verse 13 it says, "There is a generation, oh how lofty are their eyes, and their eyelids are lifted up. There is a generation whose teeth are like swords." Their teeth are like swords, and whose fangs are like knives. And so their teeth are like swords, and their fangs are like knives. And you can see that, guys, not just in the world. I'm addressing some issues in the church here as well. And what happens is we start backbiting one another. Because we're lovers of selves more than lovers of God, our teeth become like swords. Instead of having a sharp two-edged sword come out of our mouth, which is the Word of God, our teeth become like swords, and we start biting each other's flesh instead of using the sword of the Spirit to crucify our own flesh. But that's a whole nother message. So we're taught this is the picture of the generation, that a generation who has a form of godliness but denies the power, a generation that loves itself more than it loves God, a generation that despises the older generation, that does not bless, that curses its father, and then doesn't bless its mother. They put off everything that has happened to them wrongly. Their current situation is due to what the generation before them. And even in the church, we make the excuse, well, I don't have this, I don't have that, because the generation ahead of me, they messed up in these areas. No, we should be thankful for some of the pioneers that went before us. We should be thankful for some of those that had prayed in the secret place and pioneered in the place of prayer to have what we have today. And so that, again, with the generations, I want to go now and let's go and look at a familiar passage to most of us in Genesis chapter 37. And this is the message of Joseph. This is the story of Joseph. We know that Joseph was the son of his father Jacob, and that he was highly favored by his father, so much so that it says that he had a coat of many colors. And in Genesis chapter 37, verse 3, it says, "Now that Israel, which is Jacob, loved Joseph more than all his children, and made him a coat of many colors. And when his brethren saw that their father loved him more, then all his brethren hated him, and they could not speak peaceably to him." And so you can see what happens, guys, when you are favored by a father, when you walk in the favor of the Lord, that it's going to cause some issues amongst your brothers. It's going to cause some certain things there. And here's the thing, though, guys. Those the brothers there, they had the same access to the Father. They, just like the prodigal son in that message, you see the prodigal was away at the pig's trough, yet he came back to the Father. The Father had a ring and a robe ready for the prodigal son. But the elder brother that was there at the farm, at the house, the elder brother had the same access. He got envious of the prodigal son that came back. He got envious of his brother, but the whole time he had full access to the ring and the robe and the father's presence. And so with that, we can't become envious when we see the blessings upon our brothers. We can't become envious when we see those things. But we see this in the whole story of Joseph. Genesis 37, he's got this coat on, and then all of a sudden, he starts getting this dream. He gets this dream that he saw the interpretation basically is he saw that his family was bowing down to him, that he was coming to a place of prominence, a place where he would be exalted and lifted up, and his brothers would be kind of bowing down to his position. And so it says in Genesis 37, verse 7, "For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose and also stood upright. And behold, your sheaves stood round about and made obeisance to my sheaf. And his brother said to him, Shalt thou indeed reign over us? And it says, have dominion over us. And it says, and they hated him yet the more for his dreams and for his words." Now back up in Genesis 37 and verse 4, it says when the coat was on him and they saw the favor of the Father, it says they hate him. Now he's got a dream that's happening that shows his future and his destiny, and he shares that dream, and when he does, it says they hated him even more. So you see how hate has now escalated from hate to hate even more. Well, it's about to get a little worse. And so it goes from hate to envy. Look at this. In verse chapter 10, it says, and he told it, Joseph had another dream about the sun and moon and stars. The first dream was about the sheaves. The second dream is about sun, moon, and stars. And it says, and he told his father and told his brother, and it says, and his father rebuked him and said unto him, What is this dream that thou hast dreamed? Shall I and thy mother and thy brethren indeed come and bow down ourselves to thee in the earth? And in verse 11, here's where it says, and his brethren envied him, but his father observed the saying. So his brothers went from hate to envy. From hate to envy. And it all started with a garment, but now we're addressing gifting. And so what happens is you'll see sometimes, even in the churches and in ministries, we'll start envying one another's giftings. We'll start envying one another's garments. We see the Lord exalting a certain ministry in its season. We'll see a Lord exalting another brother and bringing their message up to the forefront because the body at large needs it. And a lot of times as ministers or as leaders of a ministry, we'll see this other message get exalted in that season, and we're looking at it, and we start, if we're not careful, we'll allow hate and bitterness and then envy to come into our lives, and jealousy to come in because we're seeing somebody else exalted and somebody else's ministry is exalted, but instead of our own. And so it says his brother envying anymore, and I believe it's in the book of James. It says that where envy and strife are, there's every evil work. So you're opening yourself up for attack when you allow envy to be in your life. So they envy him, and then they come and conspire against him. So they have this conspiracy, say we've got to slay him, we've got to do something about this Joseph. And so they come up with this plan to slay him, but then they're like, no, we'll do something else. We'll put him in the pit. And in verse 23, it says, and it came to pass when Joseph was come to his brothers that they stripped Joseph out of his coat, and it says his coat of many colors that was on him. And they took him and cast him into the pit. That's verse 24. And the pit was empty, for there was no water in it. And they sat down to eat bread, and they lifted up their eyes, and looked, and behold, a company of Ishmaelites came, and with their camels, bearing spice, balms, myrrh, going to carry it down to Egypt. And Judah said to his brothers, what profit if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? So in verse 27, come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites. Let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh, and his brothers were content. So they put him in the pit, but then the Ishmaelites come, and so they're like, okay, instead of slaying him, it's not going to be prosperous for that. We can sell him. And so they sell him to the Ishmaelites. The Ishmaelites take him out, and he goes to Egypt. But I want to look at that, guys. I want to look at this part. He was stripped from his garment. Joseph was identified by his father by his garment. Yet here in this process of the pit, he was being stripped of his garment, which is a picture of being stripped of his identity. And so here he had this dream of this great ministry that he was being called to, that he was going to be in this place of ruling and reigning. Yet the first step after the dream is this place called the pit. Many of us go through this same type of season. We'll have this great word from the Lord, or we'll have this great insight, and we'll get all excited. We'll get all pumped up, and we'll really start pursuing the things of God because we've got this fuel of a dream that came to us. And then all of a sudden we got this attack. We try to share it with the very people that we thought that we could trust. We try to share it with our own brothers, thinking they'll be excited for us. But instead of being excited for what the Lord was showing us, they become envious instead of excited. And next thing they know, they conspire against us. And so when he got this dream of this great thing that the Lord was going to do with him, sometimes, guys, you can't always share what you get. You've got to take that word. I believe this is where Joseph may have messed up a little bit. Instead of sharing his message, he should have took that message, took that dream, prayed over it, waited on it, and then over the process of time, release it in the right place and to the right people. So just a little nugget there. If God gives you something, hold on to it for a minute. Bathe it in prayer. Bathe it in fasting. Bathe it in the Word. Set it up on a shelf. Steward over it in the secret place before you try to take it openly. Because learn from Joseph here. If you share something that God gives you in secret openly and you share it prematurely, you may just find yourself in a pit. So anyway, Joseph is stripped from his identity, stripped from his garment. He's found in this pit. And I believe in this place of the pit, I'm just trying to think about Joseph's thoughts and Joseph's feelings in the pit. And with Joseph being in the pit, just think, it used to be a well, because it said there was water there, but the water was no longer there. It used to be a well. So I can just imagine being down in this well, looking up. See, the pit, what will happen, guys, when we find ourselves in the pit season, when we find ourselves in a place where there used to be water, but there's no longer water, it can get sticky, it can get muddy. We start moving slowly, things get clingy to us, and there's a lot of darkness around us in that pit season. And there's only one way that we can see light, and that's to look up. And I believe that pit became like tunnel vision and an increased focus for Joseph. The only way that he could even see any help, the only way that he could have any light was he had to look up. And so he couldn't allow himself to be so focused on his surroundings. He couldn't allow himself to be focused on the mud and the mire that he was stuck in. He had to look up unto the hills from which comes his help. So he had to have a tunnel vision, almost like a telescope, guys. Think about it, being in this round pit. It was almost like a telescope looking up, and he could look up to heaven where his real Father was, where God was. And so he had to get his right perspective. The pit is about getting right perspective back. And sometimes we can get a little prideful when the Lord shows us some things, and if we don't steward over it in prayer, then we share it prematurely, then we can find ourselves being humbled in a pit. And so I believe Joseph is finding himself, yes, his brothers conspired, and yes, it wasn't his own fault. He didn't place himself there. His brothers came against him, but at the same time, I believe the pit was a humbling experience that got everything focused, got Joseph's focus back on the right things. It got Joseph's focus back on the main thing. You've heard it said that the main thing being the main thing. And so Joseph was getting his thoughts and his intents back on the main thing. It wasn't just focused on my ministry or my dream and that one day I'm going to rule and one day I'm going to reign. No, before he could rule and reign, he had to go through this humbling process, this almost breaking or shaping and molding process. And so here he was planted in a pit like a seed. And we know throughout the scriptures that there's as long as the earth remains, it says there'll be seed time and harvest. So a lot of times when the Lord shows you something, he may show you the harvest, but the function of it's going to come in seed form. And so here's Joseph having this big picture of a harvest of this dream, but the function of it is come in seed form, and it doesn't make sense that, hey, how am I supposed to rule and reign? But here I am in my current situation. I'm in this pit. I'm in a rough place. I'm in an isolated place. The pit was a test of isolation. And so you can see how he was handling this place of isolation. What are you going to do in this pit? And he could have sat there and he could have worried about his brothers. He could have sat there and walked around in the mud and the mire of that pit and just be like, oh, my brothers have done me wrong. My brothers shouldn't have done this. My brothers shouldn't have done that. My own family's turned against me. He could have been wallowing in the mire of bitterness. But no, I believe that Joseph looked up. He saw that. He didn't allow that to affect him. I believe that he just like a telescope, guys, he looked up from that pit and he saw an open heaven, and he pressed in and cried unto the Lord, because the scripture says that the Lord was with Joseph. Even in the pit, it says the Lord was with Joseph. And so I believe this pit is the process. It's the seed form of the function of the dream that he had on his way to the palace. And so in this pit of isolation, guys, he's having to really he's being stripped of his identity, which was the coat of many colors. Now he's isolated from his family. He can only focus on him and the things of the Lord. And so over a process of time, it says he's out of the pit. He's sold to the Ishmaelites, and from the pit he ends up to this place called of Potiphar's house. And in Potiphar's house, it says the Lord was still with Joseph, and that Potiphar even recognized that the Lord was with Joseph. And so when he did, he saw favor started happening. The favor that was on Joseph brought favor in Potiphar's house, and things started being blessed in Potiphar's house. And so he continued to serve and be elevated even in Potiphar's house as a slave. With that, we know the test that comes here, guys. I believe this is part of the process of advancement. In this place, Potiphar's wife comes at him because Joseph, it says he was fair to look upon and everything. And so Joseph's wife comes at him basically with sexual temptation and sexual immorality. And if this generation's dealing with anything, we're definitely dealing with sexual immorality. We're seeing it all on websites. We're seeing it on our phones. We're seeing it on TV. And so that not only is this generation dealing with isolation from its brothers and sisters and family and all that, because there's division there, we're dealing with isolation, but now we're in this place where the generation is having to deal with sexual temptation and sexual immorality, advances that are coming from all sides and all forms that's coming. So Potiphar's wife came and advanced herself towards Joseph, and Joseph refused. He was a man of righteousness and uprightness with the Lord, and so he refused the sexual immorality. He refused that temptation. But what happened with that temptation? It says that when he ran. And so we've got to flee from the lust of the flesh. We've got to flee from those things. When we find ourselves in that situation, guys, we can't stay there long. We've got to recognize the situation and move. As a believer, we got to recognize it and then run. And so Joseph, as he was recognizing the situation, he found himself fleeing from that temptation. And in the process of fleeing, it says that she stripped off his garment again. She stripped off his robe. And so here's where the false accusation came. So when Potiphar was away and then now he's come back, Potiphar's wife goes to Potiphar and she shows him the garment. She shows him the garment, says, look, what I tell you is the truth. Joseph was trying to advance himself on me, and here's proof. Here's his garment. So for a second time, Joseph was identified by his garment. But for a second time, again, he was stripped from that garment. So know this, as you are pursuing after the things of the Lord, there's going to be another process of stripping. There's a process of removing things that you once identified yourself with. Joseph identified himself with the coat of many colors. That got stripped. Then he goes through this next level of process, and he's got that identity, his coat from Potiphar's wife was removed by Potiphar's wife, and so that's another level of identity being stripped. His robe was removed, so a coat removed, and now a robe removed. So another level of how this generation identifies itself is being removed. And so he remained faithful. Even in the stripping process, even with false accusation, he remained faithful. And it says God was still with him. And so he goes from Potiphar's house. He ends up now into a prison. And so here he is at a prison. And I believe because he was stripped, it doesn't necessarily say there, but because he was stripped from that robe, now he finds himself in a prison. And so I believe that goes without saying here that he has another garment on. He's not just going to be naked in a prison. So here he has another robe or another garment on, of almost like these prison garments. So we find him sitting in this prison. And in this prison, and you'll find it in Genesis chapter 39. It says over here, and it says, Genesis chapter 40. Genesis chapter 40, it says, it came to pass after these things that the butler, the king of Egypt, and his baker offended their lord, king of Egypt. And the Pharaoh was wroth against two of his officers, against the chief of the butlers and against the chief of the bakers. And he put them in the ward of the house and the captain of the guard into the prison, the place where Joseph was bound. And so we know that Joseph was put in the prison, in Genesis chapter 40. You can actually find it in Genesis chapter 39, verses 20 through 23. You'll see that Joseph was placed in the prison. But here, Joseph is in this prison, and while he's in this prison, these other guards, these other guys that were from a higher position, are now placed in the prison itself. And in Genesis chapter 40 and verse 5, it says, and they dreamed a dream. The butler and baker both dreamed a dream. And it says, each man his dream in one night, each man according to the interpretation of his dream. And it says, the butler and the baker, the king of Egypt, which were bound in the prison. And Joseph came unto them in the morning and looked upon them, and behold, they were sad. And verse 6 says, Joseph was in this prison, and this butler and baker had been placed in the prison, and they had both had a dream. And in that dream, they had the dream, but they didn't have the interpretation thereof. And so Joseph, in this prison, recognizes the countenance of the butler and baker. And I just find that kind of fascinating that Joseph, again, wasn't too concerned about his situation. He wasn't focused on, why am I in this prison? Why have all these bad things happened to me? You know, I've been in this rough situation. You know, my brothers have come against me. My own family's come against me. You know, I've been in isolation. I've gone through this process of isolation. I've gone through this process of false accusation. And now I find myself in a prison. I shouldn't be here. I had a dream from the Lord. I had a calling from the Lord. How am I end up in this place? It looks like I'm going further away from the dream than walking closer to fulfilling it. And so Joseph, as he's in this prison, is not so focused on his situation, because he notices the countenance of the butler and baker. And so he said, why are you so sad? And he said, we have a dream. The butler and baker, they look at Joseph and said, we have a dream, but there's no one there to interpret. And Joseph looked at him and said, do not interpretations belong to the Lord? And so if interpretations belong to the Lord, then where must we go to get the interpretations? To the Lord. So Joseph is, you can almost see, almost like an evangelistic tool here, guys, of how God was using a dreamer to interpret dreams to point people to the Father. You had the butler and baker that was serving a heathen king be put in a prison, and as they approached the man of God, Joseph says, I recognize what's going on in your life. I understand dreams, and dreams belong to the Lord, and so we must go to the Lord to get them. I believe God is using the generation of dreamers that'll point people to the things of God. And so this is just part one, guys, of what happens when generations come together. We're just diving into this, so be sure to stay tuned and tune in next week for to see what happens when we discover when the generations come together and that Joseph is alive and Jacob is revived. Hey everyone, I'd like you to go to the website and check out Remnant Voice on the web. Go to remnantvoice.tv. There on remnantvoice.tv, you'll be able to find episodes on demand, past episodes, shows that you may have missed. You'll be able to find those episodes at remnantvoice.tv. Also, I'd like to invite you to stay in touch with the ministry, Remnant Fire Ministries, on the web as well. Go check us out at remnantfireministries.com. There on the website, you'll be able to read articles that are posted there. Also, you'll be able to keep track of the schedule that as I travel and minister at different locations, you can find out where I'm at by remnantfireministries.com, and then under the schedule tab, you can find out where I'll be ministering there. So again, I want you to check out remnantvoice.tv and remnantfireministries.com. Hey everyone, I'd like to invite you to connect with Remnant Fire Ministries across several social media platforms. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Remnant Nation. Also, you can find us on Twitter at twitter.com/Remnant Fire. We are on YouTube as well, and on YouTube I'll be posting and uploading videos and episodes of the show. You can find us on YouTube at youtube.com/The Remnant Fire.